Well, hi, everybody. Today we're going to be taking a little trip into your skeletal muscles, and we're going to be talking about how they actually flex. What are the structures inside our muscles that exist? How do we engage them? And when we do, how do they exert force on our bones to make us move? So we want to be thinking about a few things. First of all, we're talking about skeletal muscles. We're not talking about smooth muscles, which are in your digestive tract. We're not talking about cardiac muscles, which have to do with your heart and some of your blood vessels. But we're talking about those skeletal muscles that move us around. Okay? So before you start, I'd like you to take notes on this because the best way to learn it is to draw it and practice it. So you're going to need pens or markers, but if you have markers, you're going to need to write in pen and then kind of highlight over it with a marker. But you need it in all those colors below. So black, red, blue, green, purple, yellow, and orange. And just in case you're a very colorful person, you might want to bring some more as well. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to get out of the way here. All right, so it all starts here with my massive muscular arm. And that muscular arm, that is a true picture there, has in it, of course, these little striations we call muscles. Okay, so the muscle is right there. Now we know that muscles connect to a bone. So they don't just connect all by themselves, they connect to the bone through tendons. And tendons are kind of these not so vascular. They don't have too much blood going through them, but they're stiff, they're firm, and they hold onto the bone really tightly, and then they connect to the muscle. So we're going to take a slice out of my arm here, all right, if we're cutting it across there. And we're going to start drawing at the tendon. Now, when you have the tendon, it connects to the bone on one side and then the muscle on the other. Okay, and that muscle is encased in something called epimysium. Epi just means on, mysium means muscle. So it connects, the tendon grabs onto that epimysium, and that's the connective tissue that covers the muscle. Now we're cutting through this muscle, so you see that red ring there. Okay, inside that red ring is the perimysium. So we had epimysium that covered the muscle and its connective tissue. The perimysium, peri means around, mysium means muscle. So the perimysium is inside epimysium, and it basically encases all these tubes inside that muscle. Okay. Now, what are those tubes called? Those tubes are called fascicles, kind of like icicle. You can kind of remember them because they're tubes kind of like icicles sticking through your muscle. They're a bundle of stuff that surrounds the cells themselves. So the fascicle holds the blood vessels and nerves that feed and communicate to our muscles. So the fascicles are really important because they're kind of like the ocean that all this information and supplies travel on to these various muscle cells. Now we're going to continue taking our little voyage in. And of course, inside those fascicles are more tubes. These tubes are called myofibers. Myo, remember, is muscle. And then fiber here relates to the cell. So a myofiber is a muscle cell. So we have the epimysium, that's the big case for the muscle. And then inside that are tubes, fascicles that are covered in perimysium. The fascicle carries all of that stuff that the cells need. So inside the fascicle and the perimysium, we have myofibers, or muscle cells. Now, we're going to take that myofiber, that yellow tube, and we're going to zoom in on it. Now, myofibers can be really, 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 really short, like teeny tiny, or they can also be several centimeters long, which is really big when you think about a cell. So these are kind of special cells for a number of reasons. The first here is these cells are covered in something called sarcolemma, which is sarco just means flesh. So that's like the covering for the cell. That's kind of the cell membrane. Okay. Now, on top of the cell and throughout, there are little lumps, and inside the lumps, you'd see these little nodules, and those are the nuclei to the cell. Now, muscle cells are interesting because one cell has multiple nuclei on it. And that kind of is a good design because if it just had one nucleus rather, and that nucleus was on a long cell, say a couple of centimeters long cell, information that's in the nucleus that tells the cell how to basically stay alive would take a long time to get all the way across the cell. So what the cells have are multiple nuclei, and those nuclei can relay information very quickly that way. Now, inside the muscle cell, there are more tubes. So you kind of may have in your head like, wow, this is just like tube within a tube within a tube. But this yellow thing here, or it's colored yellow in our diagram, not really yellow, but that is a muscle cell. Now, inside the myofiber, which is a muscle cell, is a myofibril. The myofibril is the tube inside the muscle cell that actually does the contraction. So if you think about like a bridge, a suspension bridge, and you know those big, long steel cables that go down the bridge, well, each of those steel cables is really a whole bunch of smaller steel cables wound together. That's kind of how our muscle cells are designed. So the myofibril is inside the myofiber or the muscle cell, and that's where the contraction takes place. So let's review here for a second. We've just gone from my massive bicep muscle. We sliced it in half. We have a myofiber cell, and now we're down to the myofibril, which are the strands that do the flexing. Okay, now we're going to zoom in a little more on the myofibril here. So bear with me. There we go. Now we zoomed in, so we want to find out and understand what the structures of the myofibril are, so we can finally put all this together. So we're down to the very smallest parts here of the muscle cell, the myofibril. The first thing on it, and you may have noticed this from our last little drawing there, these little zigzags that go across the myofibril. These are called Z lines, and they're evenly spaced, and the Z lines are very important for kind of pulling this fiber together when we contract. Okay, these here are just center lines that I'm putting in, and these are kind of like kind of home plate. This is where everything kind of comes back to. All right, then we have these things called actin filaments. And actin filaments are these kind of squiggly in real life. They're kind of squiggly bars, and they're evenly spaced, but they don't touch the Z line, and they don't touch each other. So they're spaced across in this myofibril rather, and they're kind of hanging out there for now. All right, the space between two Z lines is called an A band. Now, thinking ahead here, when we flex our muscle, that A band, those two Z lines are going to get pulled closer and closer together. So you can see how the muscle is going to pull together. That's what causes my massive bicep to bulge, right? When all of them do this together. So the A band is Z line to Z line. There's a thing called the I band, and we'll talk about that in a little while. The I band does not touch those actin filaments, and it's the space between the actin filament and the Z line. Okay. Now, these repeating patterns on a myofibril, this black thing here, are called sarcomeres. So sarcomeres, remember, are just repeating patterns of these various structures. All right, now we're going to go Z-line to Z-line here. So we're zooming in a little more. And when we go Z-line to Z-line, we see a few very important things. You have your A band, you have your I band, and we put some new structures in here. These little X's that I have here are like springs. They're a protein called titin. And titin is an elastic, springy protein that holds the actin filaments, those green things, and the Z band together. They're like anchors, right? But they're important because without them, the cell would kind of fall apart. So we need them there, and they're like springs that are going to pull, pull, pull. And they're going to kind of go toward the middle line as things get pulled along here, just so you know. Okay, the orange things are called the myosin. Myosin are these crawlers that will pull the actin filaments, the green things, together. And that's eventually flexing the muscle. So the myosin crawl, and as they crawl, they're kind of like pulling those green things along with them. And when you think about that pull, you can imagine it's kind of like if you're grabbing sheets, right? And you keep on squeezing with your hand, you're pulling more and more of the sheet down. And that's kind of what they do is they get engaged in the motion of flexing the muscle. Okay. Now, when all those myosin and all of the myofibers within a muscle group pull together, the muscle flexes. Now, if you just have a couple of these, like a couple of myofibrils flexing for some reason, the whole muscle isn't going to flex. But when you get all of them flexing together in a muscle group, then you're going to get some movement on whatever structure you're trying to move. So if I'm trying to move my forearm up toward my shoulder, then my bicep is going to flex, and I'm going to have a bulging muscle that may block my forearm's actually ability to touch my shoulder just because it's so massive, of course. Okay, so here are the steps. We know the structures now. We've been introduced to them. So here are the steps to flexing a muscle. There's a couple of things that are thrown in here that you haven't seen yet just because they're chemicals or whatnot. But stick with me and you can understand it. First off, a nerve excites the sarcolemma, which is that muscle membrane, and it sends an electrical message to it. So in skeletal muscles, they're voluntary movements a lot of times. So my brain will send messages through my nerves to my bicep, and it'll say, hey, it's time for you to flex. So my bicep responds, and to step 2. That message sneaks its way. It kind of excites the sarcolemma there, and the sarcolemma releases some chemicals that drop into these holes inside the muscle membrane, and those holes take that message. Number 3, that message triggers chemical reactions to splash all of those little myofibrils inside the myofiber, inside the muscle cell, those little myofibrils that are responsible for contracting. It splashes them all with calcium. And that may surprise you. Calcium's released out of our bones, right? So we know that calcium makes our bones really strong. You might say, well, why do we constantly need to be drinking milk? And the reason is because our muscles use that calcium from our bones. And so we have to replenish it, keep our bones healthy and strong. And that calcium is responsible for helping to signal our muscles to flex. So calcium goes in, splashes all over all these myofibrils, and the myofibrils get the message all at the same time in this muscle. Number 4, the calcium attaches to a protein called tropin, and tropin is just laying right on top of the myosin, those little orange things there, the crawlers. And you'll notice a lot of times when you start studying about these processes, these chemical processes, that you have to have, lots of times you have chemicals that can't be translated by certain structures without the help of a protein. So that protein attaches itself to the myosin, and then the myosin gets the message, hey, it's time for us to start crawling. Number 5, the myosin crawl. And they pull the actin, those green things there in this drawing, they pull the actin together along the A band, right, along that grouping part of the sarcomere there. So it pulls that A band together and it flexes the muscle. Of course, that's the point where everybody's amazed, right? And so walking through this, you might say, well, that's a lot of big words, but when you break them down and you understand what the prefixes all mean, it's just pretty easy, really, to figure out. Myo means muscle, and peri means around, and fibril basically means cell. So fiber means cell. So you can get all these things that are prefixes and kind of common splices of words together in your head. But as you draw it out and you start to see how the muscle actually works to perform, you have a better understanding of A, how amazing that process is, and B, how incredibly complex our bodies are and things that we just kind of take for granted. So this is a little introduction into how muscles work, and this is a good video for you to come back to just to review before you take any kind of quiz on it. So thanks for listening.